My route through Concourse C takes 11 minutes on a good day and 17 on a day when the drain at the eastern end is acting up. I do it twice, once at the start of my shift at 600, once at 1400 when the afternoon transit crowd thins out, and the garbage from the vendor machine starts to accumulate on the floor near the bins, because people on long layovers stop caring about the bins around hour 4, and I can't entirely blame them for that. It's not an exciting part of my round. Concourse C is the economy transfer hall, the one that doesn't get the good lighting or the upgraded bench panels or the vendor machines that take all 6 standard currencies instead of 3. The 3 currencies the machine on the seaside takes are the ones that sound comprehensive until you realize 2 of them haven't been in common circulation since before I took this job. The water dispenser works about 70% of the time, which is better than it was before I replaced the inlet valve 18 months ago. The benches are bolted to the floor, and the backs are at an angle that makes it uncomfortable to sleep, which I suspect was intentional on the part of whoever designed them, though they didn't think it through, because people sleep on them anyway and just look more uncomfortable doing it. Nobody goes to Torvith Station on purpose. You end up at Torvith Station because the Carath-Selen freight corridor doesn't have a better waypoint option in this stretch of the midrim, and if your connection is delayed, or your ship hit a nav hold at the approach beacon, or you missed your slot at Selen Hub, and the next available one is 9 hours out, then you're in Concourse C with your bags and your transit token and your particular relationship with the passage of time. I've been doing this for 23 years. I came to Torvith on the recommendation of a man I used to work with at the Velith extraction site. He said there was steady maintenance work and reasonable quarters, and a commissary that served hot food twice a day. And all 3 of those things turned out to be true, which is a better batting average than I'd come to expect from recommendations at that point in my life. I took the job because the Velith site had taken 2 fingers off my left hand in an equipment failure, index and middle, and I needed something where the tools were lighter and the hazard exposure was lower, and a transit hub maintenance posting fit that description. I stayed because I was good at it, and because the alternative was going somewhere else and starting over, and inertia, I've come to believe, is an underrated force in human decision-making. There are worse places to spend 23 years. Torvith is quiet in the way that a busy place can be quiet. The busyness is other people's. You pass through it but don't belong to it. And when you've been the constant thing in a flow of changing faces for long enough, you develop a particular kind of peace with the arrangement. The people come through and go. The drains silt up and get cleared. The panels need replacing on a rotation. The station continues. My wife left 3 years before Velith. She left because I was better at paying attention to things than to people, which is a fair criticism, and also because she'd found someone who was better at paying attention to her specifically, which is a harder criticism to argue with. I don't hold it against her. I'm not sure I held it against her even at the time, which may be part of the problem she was identifying. What I'm good at is noticing things. I notice things because my job requires it. Is that panel vibrating differently than it was yesterday? Is that seal starting to weep? Is that drain pulling slower than the baseline? I pay attention to the details of a space the way some people pay attention to a conversation, looking for the thing that's changed, the thing that's about to cause a problem, the thing that's been overlooked. I do not know exactly what I noticed first about her. I've thought about it since, and I can tell you it wasn't her skin color, which sounds like it should be the obvious thing to note, pale gray with what I'd later recognize as a very faint silver blue sheen, the kind that catches artificial light from certain angles and not others. But Torvith Station is a mid-rim waypoint on a busy freight corridor, and I have seen more configurations of people than I can usefully categorize. My eye wasn't on her skin. I think what I noticed first was the stillness. Not the stillness of someone sitting. Everyone in Concourse C is sitting. That's the function of the space. The stillness of someone who has made a decision to be completely still. The way you'd see stillness in an object that has been set down exactly where it belongs and has no cause to move. Not inactive, not inert, but deliberate, settled into its position. She was on the eastern bench row, back to the wall, knees together, hands in her lap, dark close-cut hair nearly black. Her eyes on my first pass were on the transit board. On my second pass they were on me. They were very dark, close to black, or what reads as close to black in the flat artificial light of the early morning concourse. Large. And I am choosing this word carefully, not startled. She was watching me the way I watch a panel I'm assessing, without announcing that she was doing it. No luggage, no bag, no transit token display on her wrist, the standard wristband that tells any reader in the station that a ticket is loaded and active. Nothing. I finished my 600 round and put in a work order for the eastern drain, which was pulling slow again. The new filter housing I'd put in had done its job longer than the old mesh had ever managed, but this section of corridor processed a particular particulate blend, and there was no escaping the maintenance cycle, only lengthening it. I put in the order and moved on to the A side. At 900 I came back through Concourse C on my way to start on the drain. I saw two of the security officers standing in front of her. Third shift security, I recognized Palorin, the younger one on the left who'd been doing third shift for about 8 months. He does his job. He doesn't look for trouble. I didn't know the officer on the right. I couldn't hear the exchange from where I was. I didn't try to get closer. What I could see was she stood, very slowly without argument. She didn't show them anything because she had nothing to show them. She picked up nothing, she had nothing to pick up, and she moved to the western bench row, roughly 40 feet away, and sat down in the same posture she'd been in before. Back to the wall, knees together, hands in her lap, watching the transit board. The security officers moved on. I went and started on the drain. At 1000 I went to the commissary for my morning break. The commissary is in the service corridor on the B side, not accessible to transit passengers, for maintenance and contracted staff only. I ate the protein tray and the flatbread and the hot red grain soup, which the commissary serves on odd-numbered days in the station cycle. I ate at my usual spot against the wall, and I thought about the drain and the filter housing, and whether it was time to put in for a different mesh grade. I did not think about her. At 1200 I was back through Concourse C heading to check a vent fitting on the B-side junction. She was still in the western bench row, same posture. The transit board above her had updated 4 departures in the next 3 hours, 3 arrivals. I saw her eyes tracking across it. She was reading it carefully, not looking for her own departure slot, something else. She was reading the carrier codes. The water dispenser at the far end was working. I'd checked it at 600. I didn't know if she'd gone to it. I went and checked the vent fitting. It needed tightening, which I did, and I logged it. Then I stood in the junction and thought about the drain and the vent, and the lighting panel on junction 12 that had been on my list for a week, and that I kept deprioritizing in favor of other things. Then I thought about her. Here's the specific nature of what I thought. She has no token. She has no bag. She had to be told to move this morning, and she moved without argument. She's been in that concourse since before my shift began, before 600. The morning charge crew didn't note her in the handoff log, which means she wasn't there at end of previous shift, which means she came in during the night cycle. The night cycle doesn't run many transits. She came in on something, or she walked in through the public access from the docking arm. And either way, she's been in that concourse for 6 or 7 hours with no sign of buying anything from the vendor machine or accessing the water dispenser. None of this is my business in the strict sense. She is not a drain, she is not a vent, she is not a lighting panel. I have no assigned responsibility for her. What I also thought, nobody looks like they have no food. I went back to the commissary. It was still inside my lunch break window. I got a second tray, worker's tray, from the maintenance contract allocation, which is included, and which I do not feel conflicted about using for this purpose. Rice grain mixed with protein, flatbread, a sealed cup of water. I put them in a carry bag and walked back through Concourse C. Here is what I did. I walked past the eastern row, past the center of the concourse, past the vendor machine at the western end. I came up alongside her bench from the left side, not from in front of her, from beside. I crouched down, which takes more out of my right knee than it used to, and I set the carry bag on the floor beside her bench, slightly behind her sightline. Not in her line of sight. Beside her bench, where it would be visible if she turned to look, but where she wouldn't have to look at it, and wouldn't have to look at me, and wouldn't have to acknowledge anything at all if that was what she needed. I didn't say anything. I straightened up and kept walking. I don't know why I did it that way instead of some other way. It just seemed like the right distance to give someone. There's a distance with certain things that you have to leave for the other person to cross on their own. You can't close it for them, and if you try, you've done something different from what you intended. I did my 1400 round. The carry bag was gone from beside her bench. In its place, on the floor where the bag had been, the container and the sealed cup, both closed back up neatly, set side by side. She'd folded the carry bag flat and tucked it under the cup. I picked everything up. I went back to the equipment bay and put the bag in the cleaning station where it belonged. Day 2. She was there at 600. Same bench, same posture, same watching of the transit board. I did my round drain check clear for once, the A-side panels, the vent on junction 42. At 9:30 I fixed the squeaking bench panel on the D side that had been on my list since the previous rotation. That kind of job is satisfying in a simple way. You find the loose fitting, you tighten it, the problem is resolved. I wish more things worked like that. At 1000 I went to the commissary. I ate. At 1200 I got a second tray. This time when I came up alongside her bench from the right side, I'd been on the left yesterday. I don't know why I switched sides. It was just the angle I was approaching from. She looked at me. I've thought a great deal about that look since, and I've tried to be accurate about it, because it would be easy to import something into it that wasn't there. It wasn't gratitude, which I'd half expected even though I'd told myself I didn't need gratitude. It wasn't suspicion, which I'd also half expected. It was something in between those two, or something separate from both of them entirely. She was looking at me the way I sometimes look at a section of piping that isn't behaving the way the schematic says it should. Not alarmed, not dismissive. Recalibrating. Running the new data against the existing model. I met her eyes for approximately 1 second. Then I set the bag on the floor and kept walking. At 1400 I did my round. The tray was empty, the container and cup back on the floor, sealed and neat. I picked them up. That night in my bunk, I thought about the look. I'm not good at nomming what I see on faces. I've spent most of my adult life in maintenance corridors and commissaries and equipment bays, and the faces I spend time with are mostly the faces of people I work with. And we don't spend a lot of time studying each other's expressions, because we're mostly looking at the thing we're trying to fix. My wife used to say I treated people like puzzles I hadn't been asked to solve, which I didn't understand at the time as criticism, but which I understand better now. The point is, I don't overinterpret faces. What I thought was, she's measuring something. Not me or not primarily me, something in herself, whether to acknowledge the transaction. Whether acknowledging it changes what it is, and whether changing what it is would cost her something she needs to keep. I turned over in my bunk. My prosthetic was flagging a low charge, which it does when I haven't plugged it in for 2 days, which I hadn't. I plugged it in. I lay there in the dark of my quarters and thought about what I'd decided in the commissary about why I was doing this. I had not decided it was because I wanted something from her. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to the shape of what happened later, and I want to get the shape right. I decided I was doing it because she needed food, and there was food available and I could carry it. That is a complete list of the reasons. The carrying costs me 1 tray allocation from the contract and 11 minutes added to my midday break, and neither of those things is a meaningful expense. What I also decided, lying there, was that she didn't look lost. She didn't look broken. She looked like someone in the middle of something, not at the end, not at the beginning, but in the middle of a specific and ongoing situation that required her to be very patient in a very uncomfortable place. And she was being patient in the way that experienced people are patient. Without drama, without display, without looking at the wall and doing the arithmetic on how much longer. She was waiting for something to happen that had not happened yet. I didn't know what. I went to sleep. Day 3. I want to be accurate about day 3, which means I have to be accurate about what I brought with me to Concourse C that morning beyond the commissary tray. The food on days 1 and 2 I brought because she had no food. That's a simple thing, a mechanical thing, and I don't need to dress it up. Day 3 was the same tray, but I was also bringing something else, which is harder to describe and which I'm going to try to describe anyway. I've been paying attention. That's what I brought on day 3, the conclusion of 2 days of paying attention. She had moved slightly, I noticed when I came through at 600. She was still in the western bench row, but she'd shifted 1 bench down, closer to the maintenance access corridor. The service corridor door runs behind Concourse C on the western wall. It's marked with a maintenance panel indicator, a small yellow stripe at handle height, the standard indicator we use on all service doors. But there's no signage, no directory listing, nothing that tells a transiting passenger that the corridor behind that door leads anywhere useful. On the other side of the door, the B-side service corridor which connects to the workers' bathroom, the secondary water station, the cleaning lockers, and via the junction corridor, the equipment bays. She had moved 1 bench down, closer to that door. I stopped when I noticed, and I looked at the door and I looked at her. She wasn't looking at me. She was reading something on a small display, a tablet, the cheap multi-format kind you can get in the commercial zone on a deposit of about 60 standard credits, which is not nothing but is not beyond reaching. The display cast a pale light on her face in the dim 600 concourse. She was reading something that was not the transit board. I went and did my round. I thought about the door while I was doing the A-side panels, and while I was checking the drain, still clear, the new housing continuing to justify itself, and while I was doing the Junction 12 lighting panel that I'd finally gotten to. I thought she moved closer to the service corridor. She's been in this concourse for at least 48 hours. The service corridor has clean water and a bathroom with running hot water. She knows the door is a service entrance. She's smart enough to have worked that out, or she had already worked it out before she moved, which means she's been thinking about it. She can't open it. The handle is keyed. In the spare card rack in the equipment bay, we keep a row of secondary maintenance cards. They're 1 tier below my primary card, and they're issued to contract cleaners and temporary maintenance workers, and anyone else who needs corridor access without needing equipment bay access. They open the service corridor, the cleaning lockers, and the maintenance bathroom. They don't open anything classified. I issue them all the time. I log them in the system when I give them out, and I log them back in when they come back. I took one from the rack. I logged it in the system. Temporary issue, service corridor access, duration pending. At 1,000 before my commissary break, I went to Concourse C. I set the card on the bench beside her, on the bench seat, flat, face up, so she could see the station logo and the access level color coding. She looked at it. Then up at me. I said nothing. I kept walking. At 12:30, I came back with the tray. She had the tablet in her hand and was reading something on it. I set the bag on the floor the usual way, beside the bench, slightly behind her sightline, and kept walking. At 1400 I checked. The card was gone. The tray was empty, sealed, neat on the floor. At 1600, I was heading through Concourse C on my way to lock up the equipment bay for end of shift, and I saw Palorin. He was standing in front of her again. Third shift had just begun. He'd been briefed, clearly, because someone in the security rotation had escalated the situation. A transiting passenger without a token who's been in the same section of the concourse for 72 plus hours is, from a security management standpoint, a problem that needs to be resolved before it becomes a different kind of problem. I understand that. It's not a question of cruelty. Paloran is not a cruel person, in my observation. It's a question of category. She didn't fit any category the station had a procedure for. He was asking her something. She wasn't showing him anything because she had nothing to show him. I walked up. I said, "She's with the deep clean crew. I'm her supervisor. She's waiting on clearance paperwork I left in Bay 1. Give me 20 minutes. He looked at me. The look said, "This creates paperwork either way." Then it said, "Your way creates less paperwork immediately." He said, "End of shift." I said, "I'll have it to you before end of shift." He nodded and walked off. I looked at her. She was looking at me. Her expression was the same as it had been since the first time she'd looked at me directly, that recalibrating quality, running the data, not showing the conclusion. I said, "He'll come back at end of shift. I can't use that story again." I thought about what else needed saying. I said, "I don't know what's going on with your situation, but I don't think it gets easier overnight." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, in basic that was clear and formal and had a particular precision to it, every word placed exactly, with an accent underneath it like a watermark on paper, something formal and mid-rim and from somewhere specific. "No, it won't." It was the first thing she'd said to me. I took note of the fact that she hadn't said it to reassure me. She'd said it because it was accurate, and because she'd assessed that I was the kind of person who would find accuracy more useful than reassurance. She was right about that. I nodded. I went and did the end-of-shift lockup on the equipment bay. Paloran came back at 1800 and I was in the B-side junction finishing the lighting panel I'd been working on, and by the time I came back through Concourse C, third shift had made whatever decision they'd made. She was still there, so they'd made the decision to leave it for morning. I don't know what morning was going to bring. I'd done what I could do, and I'd run out of options on that front. I went to the commissary for the evening meal, the second hot service, which is the same as the morning service but without the red grain soup because the soup is only morning. I ate against the wall. I thought about what I knew about her, which by that point was more than nothing. Here is what I knew, at the end of day 3, having been told nothing directly. She'd been in Torvith Station for at least 72 hours, probably longer. No transit token, no bag, no visible credit access. She hadn't left. If she'd made it through a transit gate, she'd have been gone, and she was still there. She was not asking for help from anyone other than whatever she'd done herself with that tablet, because the commercial zone vendor on my morning pass, I'd asked him casually, making conversation, about whether he'd had any unusual access requests at his terminals, and he'd said no, nothing out of the ordinary. She was managing something without anyone knowing she was managing it, which told me she had capabilities she wasn't displaying. She had the tablet. I'd thought about that. The commercial zone reader terminals give you 8 hours of access on a deposit. She'd been there for 3 days. Either she was redepositing something in a way that didn't require standard credit access, or she had a credit workaround I didn't know about, or she'd found a maintenance terminal somewhere with a security gap she was exploiting, which was the most interesting possibility and the one that kept coming back to me, because it implied she knew things about system architecture that most people don't know. She was reading the transit board, repeatedly and with a specific quality of attention, not for her own departure, for carrier codes and route assignments and ship name patterns. She was tracking something across the board, looking for a particular configuration to appear. She was using the service corridor. I checked the door handle on day 3 at 1600, and it had the particular oil trace you get from a certain grip angle when someone has used it more than once. She'd been in the service corridor. I don't know how many times. She'd been to the water station and the bathroom, and she'd been quiet about it the way you're quiet when you know you're not supposed to be somewhere but you've decided you have no alternative. On day 4, after she'd gone, I checked the cup dispenser at the service corridor water station, and several cups had been used. The station water dispenser in Concourse C runs luke cold, because the inlet on that stretch has never been quite right. The service corridor station runs properly cold because it's on the maintenance supply line. She would have worked that out quickly. She managed the cold. Concourse C runs about 4 degrees cooler than most of the station because it's on the outer ring, and the insulation is older than everything else. I'd left a thermal liner from the cleaning locker on day 3, folded on the bench beside the card. She hadn't acknowledged it in front of me. It was gone at 1400. She was wearing it under her tunic when I walked past at 1600. I could see the edge of the insulated collar at her neckline. And she sat, for hours, in exactly the same posture, with the particular controlled stillness of someone who is managing discomfort through discipline rather than not experiencing it. I know what that looks like. I saw it at Velith, in the shifts after the extraction equipment failure, when the men who'd been hurt were trying not to show it until the medic got there. The stillness is not the absence of pain. It's the decision to hold the pain inside a particular container, so it doesn't get into anything else. She was holding something in a particular container. She'd been doing it for 3 days. And whatever she was waiting for, whatever transmission she'd sent, whatever frequency gap she'd found, whatever person she was watching for in the carrier codes on the transit board, it hadn't arrived yet. I also thought about the tablet. She'd had it since day 2 at the latest, and by day 3 she'd been reading something on it that was not the transit board. A different application, with a different layout. I'd caught the display at an angle on my 1600 pass and seen a density of text that didn't match the transit board's format. She was reading documentation. Technical documentation, or something structured like it, columns, headers, nested text, the visual layout of something that has to be precise. I'd put in enough time with station schematics and maintenance manuals to recognize the difference between something built for information retrieval and something built for casual reading, and whatever was on that tablet was built for information retrieval. She was looking something up, something specific and technical. I thought about what that meant, combined with the frequency gap she'd mentioned later. But at the time, on day 3, I just filed it alongside everything else I couldn't explain. The concourse had been cold. I thought about the thermal liner. She'd taken it from the bench without saying anything and worn it under her tunic, and I hadn't brought it up and she hadn't brought it up, and that was the right arrangement. Some things you don't name out loud because naming them changes what they are. I've learned this slowly over 20 years, mostly through the mistakes of naming things out loud when I should have left them as they were. A thermal liner is not a conversation. It's a thermal liner. That was enough. I finished my evening meal and went to my bunk. I plugged in the prosthetic. It had gotten to 30%, which is the point where it starts giving me the haptic alert, and I start getting annoyed at the haptic alert. I lay in the dark and I thought about the look she'd given me, the first real look, on day 2. I thought, I have been doing this job for 23 years and I have gotten fairly good at the simple version of it, which is noticing what's wrong with the station. I have not always been as good at the harder version, which is noticing what's wrong with the people in it. My wife had a point about that. But something about the way that woman sat, the quality of her stillness, the specific patience of it, the way her eyes moved across the transit board with a purpose she wasn't explaining to anyone, made me think. This is not someone in the wrong place through accident or misfortune or poor planning. This is someone who has been put in the wrong place and is doing, with whatever resources remain to her, the precise work required to get herself back to the right one. I went to sleep. Day 4. I started my 600 round the usual way. Equipment bay, card check, sign out log. The secondary card I'd issued to her was not in the return slot which I'd expected. I'd entered duration pending in the log and I'd leave it at that until she was gone, one way or another, and then log it as returned if it came back and as lost if it didn't. These things happen. I did the B-side first. One panel replaced on the junction 9 stretch. Drain on the B-side eastern spur, clear. Vent fitting on junction 27, tightened. I do this work with a particular quality of attention that I've developed over 23 years, not absent, not distracted, but present in a narrow way, the way a person can be present who is used to the work and doesn't need to think about it consciously. It leaves room, in my experience, for other things to be present at the same time, in a quieter layer. I came through to Concourse C at 7:20. The western bench row was empty. Bench 7 was empty. The other benches in the western row had their usual scatter of early morning transit passengers, 2 families with luggage, a Pelothian freight worker who did this route every 6 weeks, a pair of young humans who'd clearly been traveling for a long time and had that particular absence of presence that long travel produces. No gray-skinned woman with a tablet and no bag. I stopped. I did a slow check of the concourse, eastern row, central area, the transit gate end. She was there. And she was not alone. There were 6 of them. 6 figures in matching formal attire. I didn't know the style, but I know formal escort attire when I see it, the same way I know a uniform without knowing the branch. Deep gray fabric with silver thread edging at the collar and cuffs. Upright posture, all 6 of them, with the particular uniformity of people who practice it. They were positioned in a loose semicircle near the transit gate, not blocking it, but near it, with the intent of using it shortly. Their hands were at their sides. They were not armed, at least not in any way I could see, but they had the composed quality of people who had already assessed the space when they came in and made the relevant decisions about it. She was in the center of them, her back to me, facing the transit gate. Same height, same close-cut dark hair, but different even from 40 feet away, different, and I want to try to say how. She'd been sitting for 3 days in the same posture, controlled, deliberate, contained. What I was looking at now was the same control, the same deliberateness, but in a different orientation. Not contained, settled. The difference between something held in place by effort and something resting in its correct position. The same woman. But the space around her was different in a way I couldn't have named but recognized. I almost kept walking. The seaside drain needed its end-of-week check, and the vent above the transit board was on my list, and there was a light fitting at Junction 3 that I'd been putting off for 2 days. I had things to do. Whatever was happening near the transit gate was clearly resolved, or in the process of resolving, and it was not my business. She turned. I don't know if she heard me come through the concourse entrance, or if one of the escort figures noticed me and she responded to that, or if she was turning for some other reason and I happened to be in the direction she turned. All I know is she turned, and she was facing the length of the concourse, and I was at the far end of it, and she looked at me. I stopped. She said something to one of the escort figures, something I couldn't hear from across the concourse. The figure she'd spoken to glanced in my direction briefly, and then returned to attention. She began to walk toward me. The escort moved with her, flanking her, 2 on each side and 1 behind, slightly behind and to the sides, the way people move with someone they are responsible for. I stood where I was. I had my maintenance trolley with me, the one with the replacement panel housings and the drain cleaning kit and the vent fittings. I put my hand on the trolley handle. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, so I did what I always do when I don't know what to do, which is hold still and wait to see what the situation requires. She crossed the concourse. She was wearing the same gray tunic she'd worn for 3 days. The escort behind her was in formal deep gray with silver thread edging. The contrast was visible, and she didn't appear to notice or care about it. She stopped 3 feet from me. Her eyes were exactly what I'd noticed at 600 on day 1, very dark, very steady, very large. The silver-blue sheen of her skin was more pronounced in the full artificial daylight panels than it had been in the dim morning of the first sighting. She was looking at me with the same quality of attention she'd been using when she looked at the transit board, reading, not displaying. One of the escort figures had positioned themselves slightly forward and to my left. I was aware of this. I decided it was not my problem. She said, "Your name is Das Harkin." It wasn't a question. I said, "Yes." She said, "I know this because you gave me a card with your work registry on it. Your name, your station identification number, your department designation, and your shift assignment are printed on the reverse of the card." I read them. A pause and then, 3 times, because the first 2 times I was not in a condition to retain information reliably. The third time it stayed. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. She said, "I have 3 minutes before my escort takes me through the transit gate. We are boarding in 8 minutes. I want to use these 3 minutes for a specific purpose, and I would like to do that without either of us hurrying through it." She looked at me steadily. "Is that acceptable?" It was not a question. I said, "Yes." She nodded. She said, "I am Empress Oren Thas of the Cathali sovereignty. That is my full formal designation. The challenge to my authority, which was filed by a faction within my own court during the third transit leg of what was intended to be a trade negotiation at Selen Hub, was resolved 41 minutes ago by confirmation from the standing judiciary of the sovereignty." She paused. The judicial confirmation was transmitted on a frequency that the opposing faction did not think to block, because they did not know I had access to a maintenance terminal with a gap in the third-level encryption protocol. I found that gap on the second day. I sent 3 transmissions on the third day. The third one reached my head of security. She paused again. "My head of security is not dead. The report to the contrary was accurate in that she sustained serious injuries in the initial engagement. It was inaccurate in every other respect. She is, in fact, alive and in good health, and she arrived at Torvith Station 48 minutes ago with this escort," she said. "The ship that was impounded at Dock 14 has been released. I will be home by the end of this station cycle." I looked at the escort and then at her. I said, "That's good." She said, "Yes." She held that for a moment and then she said, "I am going to tell you something specific, and I want you to understand that I am not saying it as a courtesy or as a formal acknowledgement. I am saying it because it is accurate and because accuracy is something I consider worth preserving." She looked at me directly. "3 days ago, you left food on the floor beside the bench where I was sitting. You returned the following day and did the same thing. You gave me a card that provided access to water and a working bathroom, without explanation, and without any expectation of explanation from me. On the third day, when a station security officer asked me to produce documentation I did not have, you intervened in a manner that cost you a particular story you can only use once." I said, "I know." She said, "I noticed several things about the manner in which you performed each of those actions. I'm going to tell you the one I considered most significant," she said. "You did not place the food in front of me. You placed it beside me, to the side, slightly behind my line of sight, so that I was not required to look at it or acknowledge it in the moment of its being placed there. The position you chose gave me the option of ignoring it if that was what I needed to preserve something. You gave me that option on each occasion. On the second day, you approached from a different side. On the third day, the card on the bench seat rather than in my hand." A pause. "That is a distinction. The distinction is, in front of requires a response. Beside allows a response on the recipient's own terms and timing. You understood this, or you acted on an instinct that arrived at the same place, which is functionally identical. The result was that on each occasion I was not placed in debt to you before I had decided whether I wanted to be. I was given the choice. That is not how most people perform kindness. Most people perform it in front of, which serves the person performing it more than the one receiving it," she said. "You were not performing it for yourself." One of the escort figures said something in a language I didn't know. She raised one hand slightly without looking at them. They waited. Said, I'm going to tell you one more thing. In the course of those 3 days, you gave me food twice and a working key once, and one use of a story that cannot be reused. What you did not give me at any point was an explanation, a question, a request, or a look that required something from me in return. People who perform kindness in circumstances like the ones I was in almost always require something in return, even if what they require is only the confirmation that you are grateful. You required nothing. I observed this. She said, you should know who you were kind to. I thought about that. I stood there in Concourse C with my maintenance trolley, and I thought about it the way I think about things I'm trying to be accurate about. I thought about 23 years of maintenance rounds. I thought about the eastern drain that silts up every 22 days, and the vent fitting on junction 42, and the lighting panel on junction 12 that I'd finally gotten to on day 3. I thought about the commissary, the red grain soup on odd-numbered days, the way the B-side corridor sounds slightly different from the A-side because the insulation is newer. I thought about the commissary trays with the sealed cups, and the folded carry bags set back on the floor for me to pick up. I thought she kept track of it. While she was doing what she was doing, finding the frequency gap, sending the transmissions, managing the cold, reading the carrier codes on the transit board looking for her head of security's approach vector, she was also keeping track of everything. How I placed the food, which side I approached from, the distinction between beside and in front of. She'd been running a full maintenance round of her own, in her head, on everything that was happening in that concourse, and she'd cataloged all of it with the same precision I catalog a vent pressure reading. I thought, she spent 3 days in a hard situation with no resources and no guarantees of any outcome, and she remained that still and that precise and that accurate. And the whole time she was also noticing the angle at which I put a carry bag on the floor. I said, I hope you get home safe. She looked at me for a moment. I've thought about that look. I've tried to describe it to myself accurately, which I've established is not my strongest skill, but I want to try. There was something in her eyes that was not less controlled than the rest of her. She wasn't going to let her guard down in a transit concourse in front of an escort, but there was a slight adjustment of something. The way you shift your weight slightly after standing at a particular posture for a long time, not a collapse. An acknowledgement that the long watch is almost over. She nodded once, a full nod deliberate with her chin, a nod that was a complete sentence, a period at the end of a statement, not a comma. Then she turned and walked back across Concourse C toward the transit gate. The escort moved with her. 2 of the escort figures had already positioned at the gate. I watched as she went through. The gate closed. I turned back to my trolley. I had the seaside drain to check, and the vent above the transit board, and the Junction 3 light fitting that had been on my list for 2 days. I did the drain first. Clear. The new housing was performing well. I'd only need to check it again in another 3 weeks at this rate. I logged it as clear and moved on. I checked the vent. The vent above the transit board had pulled slightly off its calibrated angle, a common thing in the outer ring concourses where the thermal differential stresses the mounting brackets over time, and I spent 12 minutes getting it back to spec and logging the adjustment. I did the Junction 3 light fitting. It was a bad capacitor, not just a loose connection. I replaced it from my trolley stock and logged the replacement and put in a parts requisition for the stock unit. At 1,000, I went to the commissary. I got 1 tray. The red grain soup was on odd-numbered day. I sat against the wall and ate my flatbread and thought about what she'd said. Beside me, not in front of me. I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't named it to myself as a decision. It was just the way I'd done it, the same way I know to approach a loose panel fitting from the side rather than head-on, because coming at it head-on changes the tension distribution in a way that makes it harder to diagnose where the actual failure point is. You give things the right angle. You give people the right angle. I don't know where I learned this, or whether I learned it, or whether it's just the way I work, but she'd named it, and the name fit. I thought about that. She'd spent 3 minutes, her last 3 minutes in a concourse before going home to reclaim an empire, making sure I knew what I'd done and who I'd done it for. I don't have a framework for the kind of life where that's what you spend 3 minutes on. I can't imagine the particular discipline of it, but I can recognize it as a real thing, the way I can recognize a weld done properly even if I'm not a welder. There's a kind of person who keeps track of everything that happens to them, in detail and without drama, so that when the moment comes that it matters, they can give an accurate account of it. I've met a few of them in my life, not many. The good station managers are like that. A mining site foreman I worked with at Velith, before the accident, was like that. He could tell you the precise sequence of events in an equipment failure 4 months after it happened, not because he'd rehearsed it, but because he'd been paying attention when it happened and the information had stayed. They're the people who see things clearly and hold them clearly and don't soften the edges when they speak them. She was one of those. She'd held 3 days of a hard situation in exact detail, and she'd taken 3 minutes to make the account accurate. I ate the soup. It was good, the way it's always good, nothing special, just exactly what it is made correctly. I thought about the number. I hadn't counted the people who'd walked through Concourse C in the 3 days she'd been sitting there. That's not something I track unless I'm doing a transit volume assessment for event capacity calculation. But I know the throughput of this station. I know what Concourse C handles in a 72-hour window. The number is somewhere around 3,000. Could be less on a slow cycle, could be more if there were delays pushing extra passengers into the economy transfer area. But somewhere in that range. 3,000 people who had transit tokens and bags and departures on the board and things to get to. None of them had crouched down to put food on the floor beside someone who had nothing. I'm not saying that to make myself out to be something I'm not. I do not know what those 3,000 people were dealing with in their own lives on those 3 days. I don't know their particular preoccupations or the quality of their attention, or whether some of them looked at her and thought about stopping and made a different calculation than I did. People's calculations are their own business, and I don't rank mine above other people's. I'm just trying to be accurate about what happened, because she was accurate about it and she thought accuracy was worth preserving, and I think she was right about that. I took my tray back to the return station. I went back to my round. At 1400, I did Concourse C. The western bench row was occupied by 2 Cathari transit workers who'd come in on an afternoon freight connection and were waiting out a 6-hour layover. The eastern bench row had a family, parents, 2 children, all human, the kind of tired that means they'd been traveling since the previous station cycle. The water dispenser was working. The vendor machine was accepting 2 of its 3 currencies. The transit board was updating with the 1400 cycle of arrivals and departures. I checked the drain, it was clear. I checked the vent above the transit board. The adjustment I'd made that morning was holding. The bench where she'd been sitting for 3 days was empty. The floor beside it was clean. There was nothing to show she'd been there at all, which is the normal condition of this place. Everyone who comes through Concourse C leaves it the same way they found it, because they're passing through to somewhere else and the space belongs to no one. I logged the vent reading. I finished my round. I went back to the equipment bay and put up my trolley and signed out. I walked back through Concourse C on my way to the commissary. Force of habit, it's part of my round, and 23 years makes a route feel like a groove in the floor, something you follow without deciding to follow it. The early evening transit crowd was building, the 1800 departure window filling the benches with the particular mix of purposes and preoccupations that a busy corridor produces. I walked through it the way I always walk through it, paying the kind of attention my job requires. The eastern drain was clear. The vent fitting on junction 27 was holding. The lighting panel at junction 3 had a new capacitor in it and would not need attention for another 18 months. Bench 7, western row, was occupied by a woman in a freight worker's jacket who was asleep with her head against the wall, which was going to hurt her neck in about another hour, but was not my problem. On my way through, I passed close enough to look at the floor beside bench 7. Floor tiles, the standard gray composite, no different from any other section of the concourse. There was a faint wear mark in the floor coating under the bench, years of foot traffic, people resting their bags, the ordinary wear of an ordinary transit space. Nothing to show that anything in particular had happened there. I've walked past bench 7 several hundred times a year for 23 years. I will walk past it several hundred more times this year, and for however many years remain before I stop being a maintenance worker on Torvith Station. It will look like it always looks. The drain will silt up every 22 days, and I will clear it. The vent above the transit board will drift off calibration, and I will adjust it. The lighting panels on the junction corridor will need capacitors on a rotating basis, and I will replace them. That's my work. It is sufficient work. Most of it doesn't mean anything beyond the immediate function it serves, which is fine. Most work doesn't have to mean more than its function to be worth doing. Occasionally something happens in the middle of the ordinary rounds that means a bit more than its function, and when it does, I try to notice it with the same attention I'd give to anything else. I notice it, I file it accurately, and I go back to work. I went to the commissary. I thought briefly on the walk. She said she'd be home by the end of the station cycle. Torvith runs a 22-hour cycle. The end of this cycle was in about 14 hours. The Cathali sovereignty, I'd looked it up on the station index after evening meal, which I don't usually do with the index, because there's rarely a reason, was 8 transit hours from Torvith at standard courier speed. She'd make it. I thought good. I ate my dinner. I put the tray back. I went to my bunk and plugged in the prosthetic, which was at 68%. I lay in the dark and listened to the environmental processing unit running its evening cycle, which hums at a particular frequency. I've learned to find neutral after 23 years of sleeping next to it. I thought about what she'd said. You should know who you were kind to. I thought, I know now. I didn't know before. And knowing doesn't change what I did. The thing I did was already done, in the order it was done, before I knew anything. Which means, I suppose, that the knowing isn't really for the purpose of making the thing more meaningful after the fact. It's just for accuracy. She wanted the record to be accurate. She wanted me to have the complete information, so that if I ever told the story or thought about it, or used it to understand something, I'd be using the right facts. I closed my eyes. I thought, the drain in Concourse C is going to need cleaning again in 3 weeks. The vent on junction 42 is holding, but I should check the bracket again in the next rotation. The lighting panel on junction 12 is good for another 6 months if the draw stays consistent. These are the things I know with certainty. The rest I know with the particular kind of certainty that comes from paying attention to something long enough to recognize it, which is not certainty in the strict sense, but is as close as my kind of work gets. I know the drain. I know the vent. I know the bench panel on the far left of the D side that used to squeak and doesn't anymore. I know that 3 days is a long time to hold something carefully, in a hard place, with precision, while also noticing the angle of a carry bag on a floor. I know that most things of value don't announce themselves. They just sit there, at the right angle, and wait to be seen. I know that some things are worth the 3 minutes. I went to sleep.